Imagine you're 24 years old.
Okay.
You're standing out in the sweltering heat of the Egyptian desert.
Right.
Deep inside this ancient sanctuary.
Right.
And you've never lost a battle. Like, you are completely undefeated in war.
Which at 24 is just incomprehensible.
It's totally wild, but then the highest religious authorities in the known world, they look you directly in the eye, and they don't just call you a king.
Oh, no.
No, they tell you with absolute sincerity that you are a living God, like the son of the creator.
Yeah.
Just put yourself in that position for a second. How does a human mind survive that level of, total absolute validation without just completely shattering?
I mean, it doesn't, right, it fundamentally rewrites your reality.
Right.
When the external world starts mirroring your most megalomaniacal internal thoughts, the parameters of what's actually possible just dissolve.
You just stop functioning normally.
Exactly. You stop acting like a mortal leader bound by logistics or, basic morality. And you start operating as a literal force of nature.
And that psychological unraveling, or maybe evolution, depending on how you look at it, is the exact mission of our deep dive today.
That's such a fascinating topic.
It really is. We are exploring a single decade that completely rewired the DNA of the ancient world. Based on a really comprehensive historical analysis of his campaigns, we're tracking the meteoric, hyper-violent rise of Alexander the Great.
Yeah, going from this 20-year-old kid from the mountainous edge of Greece to, well, the ruler of an empire stretching all the way to the Himalayas.
Right. But more importantly than just the geography, we're really digging into the immense psychological burden of that conquest.
Because to really understand this journey, we have to look past the mythology. We have to look at the actual physics of his military tactics.
Like the phalanx.
Exactly, the devastating mechanics of the Macedonian phalanx. And we're also going to analyze how his education under the philosopher Aristotle shaped his whole strategic mindset.
Which is something people often overlook, right?
Totally. They focus on the battles, but Aristotle gave him the mental framework. And we'll trace his increasingly paranoid, complex relationships with his top generals.
The moral compromises.
Yeah, the really dark moral compromises he made to just survive his own success. And ultimately, that forced cultural fusion that birthed the Hellenistic era right before the whole thing just abruptly collapsed.
When he mysteriously died.
Exactly.
So to understand the sheer scale of what he actually achieved, we need to look at the geopolitical landscape he was born into.
Right, set the stage.
Yeah. If you look at Greece in the century before Alexander, it's a society that is just fundamentally exhausting itself.
Oh, completely bleeding itself dry.
Right. You have Athens on one side, this brilliant naval power, doing all this experimenting with democracy and churning out monumental art.
And philosophy, yeah.
And then on the other extreme, you have Sparta.
Which is basically a military camp masquerading as a city.
Exactly. A rigidly militaristic state with arguably the most lethal heavy infantry on the planet at the time.
But the defining memory of that whole Greek world, the thing hanging over everyone, was their shared trauma.
From the Persians.
Right. In 480 BC, all these fractious little city-states had to briefly team up to survive a massive invasion from the Achaemenid Persian Empire.
This is like Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea.
Yeah, the legendary battles. And the Greeks managed to repel the invasion, sure, but not before the Persians actually captured Athens and burned the sacred temples on the Acropolis to the ground.
Which just leaves this deep, multi-generational scar.
It did. It created this permanent, simmering desire for revenge across the whole Greek psyche.
But instead of actually uniting to take that revenge, they just turn on each other.
Because of course they do.
Right. Athens and Sparta spent decades fighting the Peloponnesian Wars, and they were so focused on their own internal power struggles that they completely ignored this rising threat to their north. Macedonia, which to the sophisticated Athenians and Spartans was just this primitive backwater.
Oh, they thought of them as total barbarians.
Right. Rough mountains, semi-feudal lords, and this dialect they barely even understood.
But that underestimation was completely weaponized by Alexander's father, King Philip II.
Philip was a genius.
He really was a visionary military architect.
Mm-hmm.
He looked at the traditional Greek way of fighting the hoplite phalanx, where guys just stand shoulder to shoulder with big, heavy shields and 8-foot spears, and he saw its limits.
It was strong, but it lacked, reach and offensive flexibility.
Exactly. So Philip's solution was this absolute paradigm shift in ancient warfare.
Let's break down the mechanics of this new Macedonian phalanx, because it is legitimately terrifying.
exactly is.
He strips away the heavy armor, he gets rid of the large shield, and just gives his men a smaller shield slung over their shoulder.
And why does he do that? Because they needed both hands.
Right, because of the sarissa.
The sarissa is the game changer. It's a massive pike, typically like 18 feet long.
Which is insane to hold.
Yeah. To keep a wooden shaft of that length from just snapping under its own weight, it was usually made of dense cornel wood in two halves, joined by a metal sleeve in the middle.
So just think about the physics of that formation for a second. You have 16 ranks of men packed tightly together.
Shoulder to shoulder.
And the men in the first 5 rows lower these 18-foot pikes so they project horizontally right out in front.
Yeah.
If you're an enemy infantryman trying to attack that, you have to somehow navigate past 5 literal layers of iron spear points before you can even get close enough to swing your sword at the first guy.
It's a mobile fortress of spiked wood.
Right. I always compare the Macedonian phalanx to like a modern, heavily armored tank.
That's a great analogy.
It's virtually unstoppable from the front. If it's rolling at you, you're dead. But it's incredibly difficult to maneuver, and it's highly vulnerable on the sides and the rear.
Which is exactly why Philip didn't just build a new weapon. He built a whole integrated system to protect it. He created these elite, highly mobile infantry called the hypaspists, the shield bearers, just to guard those vulnerable flanks.
And then for the killing blow.
The companion cavalry. This elite unit of heavy horsemen armed with long lances designed purely as shock troops.
So Philip uses this whole combined arms machine to basically crush the rest of Greece at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC.
Yeah, in a single afternoon, the backwater king becomes the undisputed master of Greece.
And he forces everyone except Sparta, who just stubbornly refuses, into the Hellenic League. And his pitch to keep them all united is this massive Pan-Hellenic crusade.
Right, let's go invade Persia and avenge Athens.
But Philip never actually sees it happen.
No. In this really brutal display of just how toxic the Macedonian court was, Philip is assassinated by his own bodyguard on the literal eve of the invasion.
Which instantly makes the politics totally volatile. The Greek city-states see a moment of weakness, right?
Yeah. And this 20-year-old kid, Alexander, suddenly inherits the throne.
And the Greek city of Thebes immediately rebels. They just assume this boy won't have the stomach to hold the empire together.
Big mistake.
A massive mistake. Alexander's response is just a masterclass in calculated terror. He doesn't just beat their army.
He erases them.
He razes the ancient city of Thebes to the ground and sells the entire surviving population into slavery.
It's mathematically eliminating a threat while sending this chilling psychological message to Athens and Sparta. The boy is way more dangerous than the father.
And this level of precise, calculated action points directly back to his education, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because he wasn't just a thug with a crown. From the age of 13, he was tutored by Aristotle.
One of the greatest minds in history.
Right, and our sources emphasize this. But if we really dig into what that means for a military commander, Aristotle wasn't just teaching him poetry and ethics.
No, Aristotle was the pioneer of empirical observation. He taught his students to categorize the natural world, to understand geography, biology, meteorology.
So how does that help a general?
For Alexander, that philosophical training translated into a staggering advantage in logistics.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. It taught him to analyze terrain, to calculate supply requirements based on harsh geographical realities. He approached warfare not just as a clash of swords, but as a massive, complex equation of moving parts.
Aristotle essentially gave him the analytical framework to process the world he was about to conquer.
Precisely. Which brings up this really fascinating tension. Philip spent decades designing the sarissa and building the war machine.
Yeah.
Alexander just steps into the driver's seat.
Right. So how much of his early success was his own genuine genius, and how much was just, having the keys to his dad's sports car?
It's a vital distinction.
Yeah.
Philip forged the weapon. Alexander just picked it up. But the true test of his genius wasn't making the army. It was his ability to wield this incredibly unwieldy, specialized tool across varied terrain and against enemies Philip never could have imagined.
Right, because a phalanx is great in Greece, but using it as an offensive weapon across 3 continents, that's all Alexander. So the spring is released. Spring of 334 BC, Alexander crosses the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He brings roughly 40,000 men.
Let's look at the composition of this army because it really dictates everything that follows.
Okay, so the anchor is the 9,000 Macedonian phalangites with the sarissas.
And they are commanded by Parmenion. He's this grizzled, highly respected veteran general from Philip's days. He is the old guard.
And Parmenion's family is everywhere in the command structure, right?
Yes. His son, Nicanor, commands the 3,000 elite hypaspists guarding the flanks.
Okay, what else do we have?
You've got Greek mercenaries fighting as traditional hoplites. You have light infantry like the Agrians, who are elite javelin throwers.
Essential for rough terrain.
Exactly. And finally, the 1,800 companion cavalry, commanded by Parmenion's other son, Philotas.
With Alexander riding right there with the royal squadron.
Yep. So this force lands, and the local Persian governors, the satraps, realize they have a huge problem.
And they have a Greek mercenary commander on their payroll, Memnon of Rhodes.
And Memnon understands logistics. He looks at Alexander's 40,000 men and sees their biggest weakness.
Hunger.
He proposes this brilliant, mathematically sound, scorched earth strategy.
Right. Don't fight him, burn your own crops, poison the wells, and just retreat.
An army that size needs an astronomical amount of food every day. If the land can't support them, they'll just disintegrate from starvation.
It's the ultimate logistical counterpunch.
But the Persians refuse.
Because of pride, right.
Pride and money. They're aristocrats. They don't want to destroy their own wealthy estates to beat some invader they think they can just crush in battle.
And by rejecting Memnon, they give Alexander the exact thing he needs, a decisive battle so he can steal their supplies.
Exactly. Which leads us to the Granicus River.
Right. So the Persians set up on the eastern bank. And the geography is key here. The river isn't super deep, but the banks are steep and muddy.
And the Persians make a really weird tactical choice. They put their elite cavalry right on the lip of the bank and leave their heavy Greek mercenaries in the back as a reserve.
Parmenion looks at this and is like, let's wait.
Because attacking up a muddy bank into waiting cavalry is basically tactical suicide.
Right. He says, let's cross somewhere else at dawn. But Alexander just completely dismisses his most experienced general and orders an immediate assault.
Which isn't just aggressive, it shows his whole leadership philosophy. He doesn't sit on a hill watching.
No, he personally leads a companion cavalry right into the muddy water, aiming for the thickest part of the enemy line.
And it almost ends his empire on day one.
Yeah, he gets bogged down in the mud, right?
Yes. And the Persian cavalry recognize him instantly because of his elaborate armor and these big white plumes on his helmet.
And it gets terrifying. This Persian nobleman, Rososes, hits Alexander in the head with a battle axe so hard it shears off part of his helmet.
It completely dazes him. And as he's dealing with that, another noble, Spithridates, rides up behind him.
Weapon raised, about to split Alexander's skull wide open.
And in a fraction of a second that literally altered human history, one of Alexander's cavalry commanders, Cleitus the Black, sees what's happening.
And he just acts.
He spurs his horse forward and severs Spithridates' arm right off his shoulder before the blow can land.
Cleitus literally saves his life in the mud.
He does. But because Alexander drew so much attention, it bought time for the heavy phalanx to trudge up the bank.
And once those 18-foot pikes are up there, it's over. Cavalry can't fight a wall of spikes.
The Persian line shatters.
Which leaves all those Greek mercenaries hired by the Persians just stranded on the battlefield.
Yeah, they hadn't even fought yet. They're surrounded and asked to surrender.
And Alexander's response here is deeply disturbing. He just surrounds them and slaughters them. Thousands of Greeks butchered by Greeks.
Yes, brutal.
Let me push back on this a bit. Looking at it strategically, was this just a blood-crazed loss of control from a 20-year-old or a calculated move?
It's a bit of both, but mostly it's a chilling calculation. Ideologically, he's waging a holy war against Persia. So any Greek fighting for them is a traitor. But logistically, Persia relied on Greek mercenaries. By massacring them, Alexander set a shockwave through the mercenary markets back home. He made the cost of taking a Persian contract absolute death.
Wow. So he's drying up their recruiting pool.
Exactly. But even with Asia Minor secure, he faces a massive strategic paradox.
The Persian Navy.
Right. They have a dominant navy in the Mediterranean. They could just sail past him, cut off his supply lines from Greece, or even fund a rebellion back home.
It's paralyzing. Usually you'd build your own fleet to fight them.
But he doesn't have the time or money for a naval arms race. So instead of playing by the established rules, he changes the game. He decides to defeat the Navy using his land army.
Which sounds impossible, but the logistics are fascinating. Ships need fresh water, right?
Exactly, they have to pull into port.
So Alexander just marches down the coast and systematically captures every single naval base. Miletus, Halicarnassus. He denies them the ground they need to resupply.
He literally starves the fleet from the shore. It's that lateral thinking we see with Aristotle's influence. When confronted with an impossible system, just destroy the system itself.
Which perfectly leads into the myth of the Gordian knot.
Oh, absolutely.
He marches into Gordium, and there's this ancient wagon tied with a knot so complex no one can untangle it. And the prophecy says whoever unties it will rule Asia.
And for centuries, men had tried to unthread it, playing by the rules of the puzzle.
But Alexander just looks at it, draws his sword, and hacks it in half.
Right. It's not just a fun story. It shows his psychology. He redefines the solution through sheer force.
And he's going to need that force because King Darius III of Persia is finally mobilizing. It's 333 BC.
Darius gathers this massive royal army, nearly 100,000 men, including the 10,000 immortals.
And Darius actually manages a brilliant maneuver, getting behind Alexander and cutting his supply lines.
But his tactical placement was disastrous. He traps Alexander on a narrow coastal plain near Issus.
Right. It's hemmed in by the sea on one side and mountains on the other. It's a bottleneck barely 6 miles wide.
So Darius completely negates his own numerical advantage. He can't flank. He has to funnel his guys straight into the meat grinder of the phalanx.
I always liken Issus to a game of chess where the board is suddenly shrunk.
Ooh, I like that.
Right. You can't use all your pawns. But even with the bottleneck, it's desperate for the Macedonians. Parmenion is on the left wing, absorbing the full fury of the Persian cavalry.
If Parmenion buckles, the Persians sweep around the rear and it's over. Plus, the center phalanx is crossing a small river, so gaps are opening up in the pike wall.
Greek mercenaries on the Persian side plunge right into those gaps. Hand-to-hand combat.
The whole left side is holding on by a thread. A normal commander would send reserves to plug the holes.
But not Alexander.
No. He's on the right wing with the companion cavalry. Instead of helping his infantry, he notices something. He realizes he doesn't need to kill 100,000 men.
Right, going back to the chess analogy, he doesn't need to take the pawns.
He just sprints his knight straight at the opponent's king, forcing a forfeit.
Yes, he forms the cavalry into a massive wedge and charges straight through the chaos, aiming directly for King Darius in his towering chariot.
Because Alexander understands the Persian army's psychology. Their morale is entirely tethered to the physical presence of the king.
So he's personally leading this wedge, getting closer and closer. The psychological pressure on Darius must have been insane.
Seeing this blood-soaked 20-year-old demon just sprinting right at you.
Darius panics. He orders his chariot to turn around and he flees the battlefield.
And seeing that chariot turn around causes an immediate catastrophic collapse of Persian morale. The army just disintegrates into a panicked mob.
Darius fled so fast he left behind his massive treasury, his tent, and even his own family, his mother, wife, and kids.
But Alexander captures them and treats them incredibly well.
Which is a huge pivot, right?
It is. He's transitioning from conqueror to administrator. He's showing the Persian nobility, look, I'm not a barbarian. I'm a legitimate, civilized alternative to the guy who just abandoned you.
But he still has to secure his rear before marching into Persia. Which brings us to Tyre.
Oh, Tyre.
Tyre was an island fortress half a mile off the coast of Phoenicia. They thought they were completely immune because Alexander had no navy.
They really misunderstood his sheer, terrifying persistence.
If he can't sail to the island, he's just going to build a road through the ocean.
A 7-month siege. He has his men tear down an old city on the mainland, carry the stones into the water, and construct a massive causeway.
The engineering is staggering. They're fighting ocean currents getting shot at from the walls. The Tyrians even launch a massive fire ship and burn all his siege towers down.
And a normal guy would just quit.
But Alexander just orders them to widen the causeway and build bigger towers.
And when the walls finally breach, the psychological toll of that 7-month nightmare is unleashed. They slaughter thousands and sell the rest into slavery.
It proved geography itself couldn't protect you from Macedonian engineering.
So the coast is secure, and he marches into Egypt.
And Egypt just opens the gates. They hated Persian rule, they crown him pharaoh at Memphis, and he founds Alexandria.
But then he makes this really strange decision. Instead of preparing for Darius, he takes a small group and marches hundreds of miles deep into the unforgiving Libyan desert to visit the Oracle of Siwa.
They almost die getting there, right? Out of water, sandstorms.
But when they arrive, the high priest greets him. Now, to Egyptians, the pharaoh is divine. But the priest specifically addresses Alexander as the son of Amun, the king of the gods, who the Greeks equated with Zeus.
This brings us back to our intro. For a young man who already thought he was descended from Achilles, hearing the high priest confirm his divinity.
It's a point of no return psychologically. He shifts from a king seeking revenge to a demigod fulfilling a cosmic destiny.
And we see the immediate consequences. Back in Greece, King Aegeus of Sparta looks at Alexander acting like an Eastern monarch and says, "That's not a god, that's a tyrant."
So Sparta rebels. And Alexander's regent, Antipater, has to fight a massive battle at Megalopolis just to keep Greece subjugated.
It's this intense contrast. In the East, he's a divine savior. In the West, his own people are bleeding to stop him from becoming a despot.
And right in the middle of this, Darius sends him a letter,
offering him half the empire west of the Euphrates, an unimaginable fortune in gold, and his daughter's hand in marriage.
Parmenion supposedly tells Alexander, "If I were Alexander, I would accept the terms."
And Alexander says, "So would I if I were Parmenion."
Exactly. He rejects it completely. A demigod doesn't share the world.
Which sets the stage for Gaugamela in 331 BC. Darius has had 2 years to build an army specifically to destroy the phalanx.
The scale is incomprehensible. Bactrian cavalry, Indian war elephants, and 200-sided chariots.
These chariots have massive blades on the wheels to literally sever the legs of the infantry.
And Darius learned his lesson. No more bottlenecks. He picks a massive, dusty plain and spends days flattening the terrain so his chariots have a smooth runway.
So how does Alexander counter that? He does something completely baffling. He orders his entire right wing to march diagonally to the right, away from the flattened terrain.
It's a masterstroke of tactical manipulation.
Right.
Because Darius sees him moving off the runway. If he reaches rough ground, the chariots are useless.
Yeah.
So Darius panics and stretches his own left wing to mirror Alexander and block him.
But if you stretch a rubber band, the center gets thin.
Exactly. A gap opens in the middle of the massive Persian line.
Darius realizes his center is thinning, so he unleashes the scythed chariots straight at the Macedonian center to break them.
The psychological terror of that. Hundreds of bladed chariots accelerating in a dust cloud.
But Alexander drilled his men for this. I compare it to a matador stepping aside for a bull, right? Using the enemy's momentum entirely against them.
Yes. The phalangites just step aside. They open massive lanes in their own formation. Horses will naturally take the path of least resistance rather than hit a wall of shields.
So they pass harmlessly through, and the light infantry in the back just destroys them. The superweapon is neutralized by footwork.
And with the chariots gone and the Persian center exposed, Alexander turns his cavalry wedge around and plunges straight into the gap, aiming for Darius again.
Ischius on a grander scale. Darius's nerve breaks again and he flees. The center collapses.
Alexander is minutes away from capturing him and ending the war.
But then a desperate rider catches up to him. Parmenion is in trouble.
Huge trouble. By stretching the line, Alexander essentially used Parmenion's left wing as bait, and they are being completely overrun by Persian and Indian cavalry.
They're even looting the Macedonian baggage camp, so Alexander faces this terrible choice. Capture Darius and win, but let Parmenion and half the army die, or abandon the ultimate prize to save his men.
It shows the internal conflict, but he makes the necessary choice. He abandons the pursuit, turns back, and slams into the rear of the forces encircling Parmenion.
The bloodiest fighting of the day. 60 of his elite companions die, but he saves the army.
Gaugamela is the death blow. Alexander marches into Babylon and Susa. He sits on the golden throne.
But then they go to Persepolis, the spiritual heart of the empire.
And this is a profound ideological conflict. He wants to be the legitimate successor, keeping Persian administrators in place.
Yet he lets his men loot the city. And then, after a drunken feast, he burns the royal palaces to the ground. Why destroy the symbol of the empire you just won?
It's a violent collision of his two identities. To rule the East, he needed to be a Persian king. But to keep the loyalty of his Greek army, he had to fulfill the Panhellenic oath. Burning Persepolis was a fiery performance to prove to his veterans he hadn't forgotten who he was.
Vengeance for Athens.
Exactly. But his reality is destabilizing rapidly. Look at how Darius dies.
Right. Darius fled east, but his own governor, Bessus, betrays him, stabs him, and declares himself king.
When Alexander finds Darius's body, there's no triumph. He takes off his own royal cloak and covers his rival. He orders a magnificent royal burial.
Because by honoring Darius and framing Bessus as a usurper, Alexander cements his own legitimacy to the Persian nobles.
But to prove it, he has to hunt Bessus down. Which brings us to 330 BC, and the darkest, most psychologically grueling phase of the whole expedition.
Pushing into the mountains of Bactria and Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan and Tajikistan.
This isn't open plains cavalry charges anymore. This is brutal, grinding, high-altitude guerrilla warfare.
Ambushes, poisoned wells, enemies melting into the snow.
And guerrilla warfare exerts a horrific psychological toll on an occupying force. The men are exhausted. And in this pressure cooker of paranoia, the toxic politics of the Macedonian court roar back to life.
Centering around Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry. He's Parmenion's son.
Philotas was arrogant and critical of Alexander's Persian customs. Then Alexander learns Philotas knew about an assassination plot but didn't report it.
In a paranoid camp, negligence is treason.
Right. Philotas is tortured into confessing and executed by the army.
But executing him triggers an existential crisis. His father, Parmenion, is an institution. He's loved by the soldiers.
And logistically, Parmenion is back in Ecbatana, guarding the royal treasury with a massive garrison. He has no idea his son was just killed.
If he finds out, he's honor-bound to rebel. He has the money and men to fracture the empire in a civil war.
So Alexander makes a decision that forever stains his legacy.
He sends assassins on fast camels across the desert. They hand the 70-year-old Parmenion a forged letter from his son, and while he's reading it, they stab him to death.
Let me ask you, was this cold-blooded murder of a loyalist, or a grim calculation to prevent a civil war?
I mean, it's preemptive murder. It's sacrificing his moral anchor to maintain control. It marks the definitive end of the old guard that served Philip.
Alexander realizes the greatest threat isn't the enemy in front of him, but the men behind him.
The camp becomes utterly toxic. A group of royal pages plot to kill him. They get stoned to death. Even Callisthenes, the historian and Aristotle's nephew, dies in a cage.
The internal rot is driven by a massive cultural schism. Alexander knows he can't rule tens of millions of Asians with just a few thousand Macedonians. He has to merge the cultures.
He starts wearing Persian robes, appointing Persian nobles.
Which his veterans see as a profound betrayal. They conquer the decadent Persians, only to watch their king turn into one.
The breaking point is proskynesis.
The Persian ritual of bowing or prostrating before the king. To Persians, it's just secular respect.
But to Greeks, bowing down is blasphemy. You only do that for gods. They're terrified he actually believes the Siwa oracle stuff. They push back so hard he has to abandon it for Greeks.
But the cultural friction is like a fault line. And the earthquake hits in Marikanda, modern-day Samarkand.
At a banquet, lots of unmixed wine.
And a drunken argument erupts between Alexander and Cleitus the Black.
The man who literally saved his life at the Granicus.
Cleitus is furious. He mocks Alexander's Persian clothes, his arrogance, and his claims of divinity, while dismissing the blood of the Macedonians who actually won the battles.
And Alexander just snaps. Fueled by alcohol and probably combat stress, he grabs a spear and runs Cleitus completely through. Kills him instantly.
The moral dilemma here is devastating. The realization of what he just did crashes down on him.
He tries to kill himself with the same spear, but the guards stop him. He locks himself in his tent for days, weeping.
It's the ultimate manifestation of his internal war. The friction of trying to weld two worlds together immolated the man who saved his life.
The army fears him now, but they don't trust him. Yet, he refuses to stop the cultural integration.
I like your analogy for this, actually.
Oh, right. It's like a CEO coming into a newly acquired company and immediately adopting all the acquired company's internal jargon and dress codes, eventually completely alienating the original founders who helped build the business from the garage.
That is exactly what it felt like to the Macedonians.
So he marries Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, to secure the region, and he accelerates his urban planning, founding all these cities named Alexandria.
Alexandria in the Caucasus, Alexandria Eschate, which means the furthest.
They're military garrisons, but also massive engines of cultural assimilation.
Greek architecture, theaters, language mixing with local traditions. It lays the bedrock for the Hellenistic age.
But his geographic curiosity isn't satisfied. He looks toward India.
He actually believed the ocean at the edge of the world was just a few marches away.
In 326 BC, he crosses into modern Pakistan. The climactic battle is at the Hydaspes River against Tingporus.
And this introduces a weapon that completely shatters the phalanx psychological stability. The Indian war elephant.
An armored elephant is basically the ancient equivalent of a main battle tank. The horses are terrified of them, so cavalry charges are useless.
And when they drive them into the tightly packed phalanx, it's grotesque. They impale men, crush them, shatter the sarissas like twigs.
Horrendous casualties. Alexander wins through a brilliant flanking maneuver, but the victory is Pyrrhic for morale.
It's monsoon season, endless rain. their armor's rusting, clothes rotting.
And at the Hyphasis River, the local guides tell them the ocean is there. There's just the massive Nanda Empire ahead, with hundreds of thousands of men and 4,000 war elephants.
So the army finally snaps.
They mutiny. After 10,000 miles and 8 years of continuous fighting, they just sit down in the mud and refuse to go further.
And this mutiny isn't about pay or food. It's profound existential dread. They realize his ambition is a bottomless void. If they don't force him to stop, he'll march them until every last one of them is dead.
Alexander tries to shame them, retreats to his tent for 3 days, but they hold their ground in silence. He finally concedes.
But he orders a fleet built to sail down the Indus River to the ocean. And on the way, perhaps out of anger, he pushes them into unnecessary sieges.
At a Morellian stronghold, he gets frustrated, grabs a ladder, scales the wall himself, and leaps inside with barely any bodyguards.
He takes a massive arrow directly into his chest, puncturing his lung.
Nearly bleeds to death. They have to hack the door down to save him.
The physical trauma is immense. When they finally reach the ocean, he makes a logistical decision that historians still debate. He sends the fleet back under Nearchus, but takes the bulk of the army on land, straight through the Gedrosian desert.
It's the greatest logistical catastrophe of his career. This guy learned logistics from Aristotle, and he marches into a desolate wasteland.
It's staggering hubris. The heat is apocalyptic. Baggage trains bogged down. Starvation, dehydration.
He loses more men to the desert than in all his pitched battles combined.
Was it a massive failure of intelligence or a subconscious horrific punishment for the mutiny at Hyphasis?
That's a dark question. Did he intentionally subject them to a living hell because they denied him the end of the world?
Either way, they stumble back into Persia, traumatized. And he finds out his empire started to rot in his absence.
Corrupt viceroys looting temples, assuming he was dead. He initiates a brutal purge, executing his own governors.
And then he implements a radical social experiment in Susa.
The Susa weddings.
He realizes to create a stable empire, he has to intertwine the bloodlines. He organizes a synchronized ceremony where 80 top Macedonian generals marry noble Persian women. He takes 2 Persian princesses himself.
Forced genetic integration.
And he pays off all his soldiers' debts. But most significantly, he unveils 30,000 young Persian boys trained in Macedonian warfare, wielding the sarissa. He calls them the successors.
The veteran Macedonians erupt in fury. They see these Persian boys and realize they're being replaced. This triggers the second massive mutiny at Opus.
The Hyphasis mutiny was physical exhaustion. Opus is about identity and jealousy. They tell him to dismiss them all and go fight with his divine father, Amun.
And his resolution of this is so modern and manipulative.
Oh, it's terrifyingly brilliant.
He doesn't beg. He has the ringleaders executed immediately. Then he gives a passionate speech reminding them they used to be poor shepherds before his father made them masters of Greece.
He weaponizes shared nostalgia.
Then he turns his back, goes into his palace, and formally transfers all the elite command titles to Persian nobles.
The psychological pressure of being permanently replaced completely breaks the Macedonians. They rush the gates, weeping, begging to be let back in.
He comes out, embraces them, hosts a massive reconciliation banquet for 9,000 people. Raw emotional intelligence and control.
But the high of that is immediately shattered. The court moves to Ecbatana, and his closest friend, his emotional anchor Hephaestion, falls suddenly ill with a fever.
Within a week, he's dead.
And it breaks something fundamental in Alexander. Hephaestion was his only true peer, his grounding wire.
Alexander's grief is apocalyptic. He weeps for a day and a night on the body, crucifies the doctor, cuts the manes of all the horses, and builds an unimaginably expensive funeral pyre in Babylon.
He's physically and mentally hollowed out.
He returns to Babylon in 323 BC. Embassies are arriving from all over the world: Carthage, Italy, Ethiopia.
But he can't sit still. He's planning a massive Arabian invasion.
But in late May, after a heavy night of drinking, he gets a sudden, deep pain in his back and a spiking fever.
Over 12 days, the man who conquered the world rapidly disintegrates. He loses the ability to walk, then speak.
And on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, at just 32 years old, Alexander the Great dies.
The medical cause is still a massive mystery.
Let's trace those theories.
While many point to malaria or typhoid fever, which were endemic to Babylon's swamps, others suggest West Nile virus. His immune system was already destroyed by a decade of trauma, exhaustion, and chronic alcoholism.
But given the paranoid court where he freely executed his own generals,
poison is impossible to ignore. Strychnine or hellebore in his wine, His officers were terrified of his purges.
But the real tragedy is his failure to prepare for his death.
Right. As he lay dying, unable to speak, his generals asked who should inherit the empire. And he allegedly whispered, "To the strongest."
Saying "to the strongest" to a room full of heavily armed, paranoid generals is basically throwing a lit torch into an armory.
It guaranteed catastrophic violence. The political empire fractured the instant his heart stopped.
The wars of the successors.
Ptolemy takes Egypt, Seleucus takes Asia, Cassander takes Macedonia.
And Alexander's own bloodline is completely erased. His wife Roxana and his infant son are imprisoned and murdered by Cassander.
Even his body becomes a weapon. Ptolemy hijacks the golden sarcophagus on its way to Macedonia and takes it to Alexandria.
And its location is still a mystery today.
The political empire collapsed because it lacked a foundation. It was a massive cult of personality held together by the gravity of a single man.
But his cultural empire succeeded beyond imagination.
The Hellenistic Age. By forcefully merging Greek culture with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions, he created a massive, interconnected world.
Greek became the lingua franca. It sparked revolutions in science, art, and philosophy, enduring until the rise of Rome.
He was a contradiction that broke the world, an empirical thinker who believed in myth, a king demanding unity while ruling through paranoia.
Which brings us back to our thought experiment. We tracked this 20-year-old wielding a phalanx, to a tactical genius defeating millions, to a paranoid, culturally fluid demigod whose ambition just outpaced human limits. Yeah.
Alexander conquered the world by never stopping. But because he never stopped to build a foundation for succession, his bloodline was erased and his empire shattered the moment his heart stopped beating.
Right.
So the question for you to mull over today is, if ultimate success requires the complete sacrifice of stability, is it really success at all?
A truly profound question to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.